Welcome to Into the Words, a podcast from the Highlights Foundation Retreat Center. Today in the cabin is our dear friend, my dear friend, Padma Venkatraman. Hello, Padma.
Hello, Allison.
How are you today?
I'm very happy to be here.
I'm very happy to have you as well. So we've got kind of a large faculty for this Getting to Know Your Novel workshop, which I love this workshop because it starts online with Sarah Aronson, and the group gets to kind of build up to then a 5-day retreat on the campus. And you've been kind enough to come.
I've been delighted to come because Sarah was kind enough to welcome me. So, thank her for the invitation.
Oh, yes. And you've been here at the Highlights Foundation before.
Yes, so thanks for putting up with me again. Thank you really very much.
Can you tell us a little bit about kind of your history here with us at the foundation?
So I came in 2006, and when I came, I already had a publishing contract. Mm-hmm. And I think that's important for me to acknowledge because it's not like Highlights gave me a publishing contract. And for me, writing is not about publication. Writing is about the process of writing and loving that. Mm-hmm. And what Highlights did give me, I felt, was my writing family. I met Jerry Spinelli, whom I still keep in touch with. Mm-hmm. And not because he's somebody who blurbs a book. He doesn't blurb books. He's just there for me as somebody who was my mentor, who I think loves me. I love him. and there's a difference in that relationship. Floyd Cooper I met, and I have kept in touch with him as well. Mm-hmm. There were people that I met that became essentially Donna Jo Napoli, Carolyn Coleman, Stephen Roxburgh. Mm-hmm. All of those people I feel like were there, always supporting me, always believing in me. Mm-hmm. And I think that was a different thing. So I felt like I really felt a sense of family, a sense of kinship. Mm-hmm. And that's why I come back to Highlights, is because it gave me that. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, I met you, Allison, later on.
And then we met. Yes. Yeah. It is. I feel that way too. And I actually, my first Highlights workshop was in 2006. I took a workshop here. And then I went to Chautauqua, and I'm just sad our paths didn't cross. Although I think they probably did. We probably had these little moments. Yeah. And they're just, we didn't even know that we'd be in each other's lives later. Yeah. Which is lovely.
That is really lovely.
So this week, you're going to talk a bit about voice, which I'm really excited to hear about. And you'll also be sharing a little about your recently named Global Read Aloud, The Bridge Home. I think what struck me so much in all of your work, I think you do a great job with difficult subjects, and you dig deep. You're not afraid of it. But this was a middle grade, and I think, sometimes maybe we think about our reader and are they ready for some topics. It was just the way that you cared, I think, about your reader, that you did it in such a way, I don't know, they felt the sense of hope, even in some pretty dark passages that were in the book itself. And I love how much you focused on this idea of how we support our family, but also how we create family. Yeah. And that was such a big message in the book. In writing The Bridge Home, maybe you were writing from a bit of a personal experience.
I think The Bridge Home was probably one of the hardest books for me to write, because I started this book. It was my second book in terms of what I started. Oh. And I put it away. And, I told myself that I was putting it away because it was, there was Slumdog Millionaire, there was Catherine Boo's Beyond the Beautiful Forever. There was so much coming out about poverty in India and the experience that people have in dire poverty. And somehow that was my excuse, if you will, for putting this book away and saying, well, it's kind of, I don't want anyone to think I'm on a bandwagon. I don't want anyone to think I'm, hopping onto something that's popular now. And I shoved it under the rug for a long time. But I realized that part of the reason I shoved it under the rug was because it dug deeper than any other book really has, in that that, Climbing the Stairs, my first novel, was about my family history and India in World War II. My second novel, Island's End, took from that experience of being the only female of color on research vessels. And so even though it's not about that, it is about leadership and being a minority. So it pulled from that part of my life. A Time to Dance pulls from my love of Indian dance and Indian music. I was never a very good dancer, but there's that, and that element of spirituality, which has always
Right.
been important to me, not defined or bounded by the confines of any particular religion, but still getting at something that to me is deeper and beyond. But when it came to The Bridge Home, it went to a place that was very hard for me to go to because I didn't accept this for a long, or not accept, I never spoke about this for a very long time because I grew up in a very difficult family place. Right, I grew up in a place, and I grew up in a situation that was hard. I was born into a family that was extremely wealthy. My brothers played polo for the state. And then when I was about 8 years old, they were all much older than me. I was there's 15 years between me and my closest sibling. But then my parents split up. And at about 8, my mother was left with me with a huge level of debt and nothing else. And then I still had to meet my father every Sunday. And there was a side of him that was extremely violent toward me. And it was difficult for me, and there were things that I didn't share with anybody at that time growing up. And I realized very, very young that I would never allow this to be the determining factor in my life. I remember thinking, I'm not going to be one of those people who always blames my father for my actions. And so I never spoke about him as an adult, except for the things that I'd seen in his life, the other part of him that I admired or that I liked. I always found other things about him that he had done that I thought were good also. And I think there's always this dichotomy in human beings, and him very much so. And so I focused on those, and I shoved all the horrible things that had happened to me that I would never wish on anyone else into this other space. And I felt I had to revisit it, in a sense, to write just that beginning scene in The Bridge
Yes.
Home, which is about violence, and you don't see it that much, but it was there. And I think the intensity of that book comes from my knowing that experience and saying that even if it's off screen, I wanted it to have that emotional impact.
Right.
Because I have read middle grades that don't carry emotional impact. And now when we see so much on screen in movies, and YA allows us now to show everything,
Right.
no holds barred. When you show a reader something shocking, if they have any compassion at all, they will move away shocked. But if you don't show the reader that, and you still want to elicit that same level of emotional response, it's much harder to do. But I wanted to push myself there so that I could do that. Because I think it was such an important book to me that I did not want people to leave without being really moved. And I think what to me is wonderful is when I go into a school and a teacher says, how many of you, almost every time the teacher will say, how many of you cried? And every child, so many, of course, there's always one kid who's like, yeah, and doesn't raise his hand. But so many children raise their hand. And then I ask them, how many of you laughed as well? And
Right.
then they raise their
Absolutely.
hand as well. And I think that to me was so important. So, although I had all of this happen to me very young, when my mother and father split up, I was the only child with that unusual family situation. So there was a lot of bullying as well in school from the other children, because children can be very kind to each other, but they can also be really nasty to
Right.
each other. And parents as well, who would be curious or in ways that were invasive to me when they couldn't confront my mother because they were scared to. And they were very cruel to me as well. So I saw the cruelty of adults around me, even toward children. And then something else that happened, which was so important to me, was that my mother, even though we had very, very little, even though it was constantly something on my mind and on hers, what could we afford? Could I even get that biscuit in that, I remember walking past this shop once, and there was this glass jar which had biscuits in it that I think now must have been terribly inexpensive. And knowing that we couldn't even, or I didn't want to ask her for those because that was not something we needed.
Right.
And once I did ask her, and she said, no, I don't think we can. And I think that all of that I carried, but I never had time to feel sorry for myself for two reasons. One, I don't like pity parties. I never did. And I never wanted anyone to feel, pity towards me, because I felt like that was something you feel for someone smaller. And I never felt smaller. I remember when I was going through something in my life, and I just remember thinking, I will not cry, I will not cry, I will not let you see me cry, because I am not smaller than you inside my heart. I am not smaller than you inside my mind. And I think I needed that as well to be on the page.
And that I think is what comes through so much in all of the children that you portray in the book, and I loved that. I mean,
and I saw children. So my mother did a lot of charity work. So unusually for me, coming from a Brahmin family, I knew children. One of my best friends was a child who now I know is Dalit, which is an untouchable. And she worked at a place which, at that point in India was called the Gypsy School. And there were several children there who were outside of the caste system, if you will. And their lives had been so horrifying that mine paled in comparison. And I didn't even experience the kind of dire poverty that they had. I had so much more than they did. I had a mother at home who was working to help me. I had a roof over my head. I had so much to feel lucky about. And these children had nothing. And they had seen so much horror in their lives. And some of these kids would, come home and talk to my mother, and they knew that I was always scribbling in this little book. And one of them said to me, will you write my story one day? And I thought I would. And in part, it's her story because, among other things, she hid in a graveyard at one point because the human beings were the threat. And, I think I'm a scientist. I've been, out in the field for years. I would say to you there are no ghosts. And yet, try sticking me for a couple of hours in a graveyard at night.
right.
I couldn't do that.
No.
And here she was doing that. And the children that I met, some of them laughed and had this joy as well that they found. And I realized quite early on that the people that were my family were people I loved. And it didn't matter to me whether they were related to me by blood or not, because there are violent men in my family, and in plural. But that's not what defines me. And what defines my family is the people that I love, the people that I care about, like my highlights family.
You love to create family. And that's, I think all of the children in the story, it felt like they were bonded in different ways where you might have expected maybe a bullying situation, or you might have expected maybe some violence. But between the children, I felt like you were so, you created such loving kids in such a hard situation, and that really came through. And also, the dog. I think that provided a level too, where we knew we were going to get this gut punch kind of at the end, right? But then we also, I'm not going to say what happens with the dog, but what you did with the dog gave us, we were already on the edge a little, a little bit. And so that was actually kind of kind to your readers to do that, even though it was hard to read. We knew we were going to break again, so we were kind of there already. Was the dog in the story from the beginning?
I love dogs.
Okay.
Please don't tell my daughter that.
Oh.
Right now, I don't, But it's hard, I think, to be an immigrant in many ways. You have parents overseas who are aging and so on. So it's not a situation we can have one, but I always wanted one. and I love animals. So I did have, I don't know, the dog showed up in part actually. In A Time to Dance, there's this scene where she walks past and there's this child who's sharing his chapati with the dog. And I've seen kids do that on the street in India. And I've seen these really, these cute, beautiful stray dogs. And that just happened naturally. to me in my head.
So I'm going to push a little bit farther on that
Yes.
then, talking about things that happen naturally in the story. I didn't know what to expect. And
Yeah.
I mean, in the story, I knew enough of the background, and I think I was a little surprised when I opened up the page and it wasn't told in verse. And I'll just say, sometimes I think when it's a very difficult subject, sometimes we look at that white space as almost a breath, right? And I had asked you about kind of the form of the story and how that came, and did you have to try several entryways into getting this voice? And you shared that it came to you just from the get-go.
It did. I mean, and I think with but I have to caveat that by saying, but with Climbing the Stairs, I rewrote 3 times with 3 completely different voices, start to finish, before I got the voice that I wanted. With Island's End, I did the same sort of thing. I chucked out. I had written essentially I had written it in multiple points of view, and then I realized one person had to just leave. So I kicked that person out. And so that was a huge revision.
Right.
And on my own, even before it went into editing or being shown. With A Time to Dance, it came to me as poetry, but then I thought, I'm an oceanographer, I have no business writing poetry. So then I did a lot of research into poetry and tried a draft that was a prose draft. It was horrible, and then I went back to poetry. With The Bridge Home, it entered my head as second person direct address, second person point of view direct address. And I just knew. And finally, I think with my 4th novel, somehow with this novel, it felt like it was in my blood. I knew that voice was right. I never doubted that voice ever. And I felt like that from that first line, I could hear this person speak, which always happens, that I can hear somebody speaking to me, but I just knew it was the voice. And the one thing that I wondered about a little bit, but then I think that was also a good thing, was to start in media res. So it isn't completely chronological. And that was something I did run by my brilliant editor, Nancy Paulson, and she said, yeah, I like that, leave that. So that was the only thing I had a question about. But I knew the voice, and it's a hard thing it's a very interesting voice. I don't particularly like novels that are epistolary novels, which have dear blah blah, love so and so, dear blah blah, because to me it gets repetitive, and it's sort of it feels forced, and it feels like a bit of a device. And this was so deviceless in my mind, and I wanted it to stay deviceless on the page, and I wanted it to feel like you were being spoken to. And then later on, somebody asked me why I did this, and then because I'm an oceanographer and I don't know much about writing, I ran to a writing book and I looked it up because it was on points of view, and it said never do a book on Sarah's point of view. It's really hard. So I thought, whoa, I'm glad I didn't see that before. So,
I think we, as readers, or I'm talking to my niece about the story as well. She said, I always could remember that she was speaking to her sister, but I felt like she was speaking to me. And I felt the same thing, and we kind of shared that and had that conversation.
Which is exactly what you want to happen in that. The one thing that I think, as a takeaway for any writers who might be listening is this. I think it's sometimes really hard to push ourselves to those places that are difficult in our lives. And it doesn't always have to be difficulty, but I think in some way, if you can reach into that emotional places, or emotional places perhaps, those emotional places in your life, then you bring something out with you that you can then carry with you. It doesn't have to be you. You don't have to write a memoir. And frankly, even if you write a memoir, you are not writing about yourself as you are today. You are writing about somebody else who was that person you were. And so I think we're always writing about character when we write. But I think if we can extract from those places, and it's not just the sadness, those happy moments, just being able to laugh with those kids, which I did. And that was the joy that I also wanted to infuse the narrative. And I think it's reaching into those places of joy as well, and sort of re-experiencing them. And and feeling them to the fullest, so then you can also help your reader feel them. Because to me, voice is like it really is a voice. It's like someone inviting you in. And to me, when you open the pages of a book, it really is like opening a door in to someone's home. And then it's not even just a door into someone's home. You think you're entering a home, but if a book is done well, you're actually entering another person's body. You're entering their heart. You're entering their mind, and you're seeing through their eyes. You know everything. You're breathing with them, and you're feeling with them.
Right.
And then I think that's what voice does for you. A good voice allows you to be immersed in someone else's soul. And I think when you leave that, you're just that much more empathetic. It doesn't mean that it has to be a book that takes you to a difficult place.
Right.
But whatever book it is, you've been inside someone else's soul, as I said.
Right.
And I think that leaves you more compassionate.
Right. I love the thought of that. I love the thought of that for kids, you know, and many adults too. Which I guess I talked a little bit about the breath maybe in a verse novel, but I think that you infused that, and maybe again it came naturally, but in your selection of kind of rounding out your chapters were very small. Like the scenes that you infused into each chapter felt complete, and you could pause then before taking the next step with your characters.
Right. I mean, to me, verse novels, I love them. I think hopefully I'll live long enough to write a few more. But with A Time to Dance, I think the dance rhythms in the book, there's, dance marries with the sense of rhythm, which is so accentuated in a verse novel. And I think also the sense of spirituality. If you didn't want it to be a sermon, if you didn't want to, impose a religion on the reader, but yet wanted to talk about a character's spiritual awakening, then in A Time to Dance, that white space is that place where you can meet the reader.
Right.
And, I think of a book always, and especially with A Time to Dance, and most especially with The Bridge Home, it's a collaboration between me and the reader. I always see it that way, because I think as a writer, all you do is you provide this key, and the reader has to then pick it up and unlock this thing with you.
It's lovely. Yeah.
Because they have to imagine that world with you. And that's also what I think empowers the reader. I think the medium of writing empowers the reader or empowers this other person in a way that is so different than, with all due respect, when you watch a movie. Because then you're looking at someone else's vision. Here you're entering and helping to see through, and you're also creating that vision. So Alison, you read the book, you have this one movie playing in your mind, right? And if your niece reads the book, she has another movie playing in you, and yet those are the same and they're different. And to me, that's also just like human beings. We're the same and we're also different. And that's something beautiful, that universality and that uniqueness coexisting is what human beings are about. And I would think a book sort of respects that. In that reader-writer relationship, in that collaboration.
Yeah. That's lovely. I think we could talk all day, but I know that you need to get back to the barn. I've seen the schedule somewhere around here. So before you go, I'm going to ask you a question that we like to ask here at the end of Into the Words, and it's about words. Can you imagine? And books. We just keep adding to our to-be-read list. And wonder if you have any recommendations of books we should seek out.
I do. I have two. They may already be on your shelves, but for anyone who's listening, two books that I absolutely love. Leslie Connor's The Truth as Told by Mason Buttle. And I'm going to cheat a little bit because Margarita Engel's Enchanted Air, I absolutely love. And she has just got a sequel called Soaring Earth, which I also absolutely love. And sequels are so often disappointing, and this one soars. So I'm kind of recommending three books, and two by Margarita, but I hope that's okay.
That's wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you so much.